Hey, how are you all? Any students here, or is this all? This is the adult. Oh, okay, good. Good, excellent. There are a few of you here. I'm going to start with some music because some of what I have to talk about is not the most cheerful stuff because our times aren't universally cheerful lately, and music is how I survive anyway. Any of you heard me play this thing? Okay. You all know, wait, is this on? You all know what that is, right? Yeah. It's called a can. It's from Laos. It's arguably the origin of digital information. If you look at it, it's got a parallel set of objects that are either off or on. There's 16 of them in this one, 16-bit number. They go back many thousands of years. They appear to be older than the abacus. In ancient times, they were traded across the Silk Route from Asia and were known to the ancient Greeks and Romans. The Romans made their own copy, which was called a hydraulis. And it was a giant, egotistical Roman version that was so big it had to be run on steam. It was operated by teams of slave boys, because despite Hephaestus's best efforts, they didn't have computer AIs yet. And the slave boys couldn't quite operate all the planks that opened and closed the holes and sink, and so they developed this crossbar system. And we know about it because there's a surviving hydraulis, believe it or not. And that automation evolved along with the hydraulis in two directions. It turned into the medieval pipe organ, and there were player mechanisms on the earliest pipe organs experimentally. And it also turned into a family of string instruments that had various assists, like the early pre-clavichord instruments that eventually evolved into the piano. The notion of automating these things was always present, so there were always attempts to make player pianos. Around Mozart's time, somebody made a non-deterministic player piano, which meant it didn't play exactly the same thing twice. Mozart was inspired by that, made some music that included dice rolls. But another person who was inspired was a guy named Jacquard, who used a similar mechanism to make a programmable loom. That, in turn, inspired somebody named Charles Babbage to make a programmable calculator, and his daughter Ada to articulate a lot of ideas about software for the first time and what it meant to be a programmer. And then, in turn, that all inspired a doomed fellow named Alan Turing to formalize the whole thing and invent the modern computer. So there's a direct line. This is it. This is the origin of digital information. Now, of course, it's not the only line, and if I was paid to be a historian, I wouldn't have told you that story with such authority, and yet I'm not. So, this is a charming tale. It's a happy place to begin. It's a reminder that inventions can bring delight and joy, and it's part of why I'm a technologist. But unfortunately, we have some matters to discuss here that are not quite so happy. We live in a world that has been darkening lately. It's not just a historical lensing effect where it feels worse than ever. It's bad in a new way. There's something weird going on. And I want to begin by trying to distinguish what's going on with our present moment of darkness as compared to earlier times. Because this is tricky. It's almost impossible, I think, to not be embedded in one's moment in time. It's almost impossible not to have illusions due to where you're situated, right? And so I don't claim to have perfected the art of absolute objectivity at all. I'm struggling, and I'm sure that I don't have it quite right, but I want to share with you my attempts up to this point. Now, the first thing to say is that by many extremely crucial measures, we're living in spectacularly good times. We're the beneficiaries of a steady improvement in the average standard of living in the world. We've seen a lowering of most kinds of violence. We've seen an improvement in health in most ways and for most people. It's actually kind of remarkable. In many ways, these are really good times. And those trend lines go way back over centuries. We've seen steady improvement as society has kind of gotten its act together. And we've been able to hold on to a few memories about things that didn't work, so we've tried new things. We've developed relatively more humane societies and relatively better science and better public health, and it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's something that's a precious gift to us from earlier generations that we should be unendingly grateful for. And I always keep that in mind. I always keep in mind that just in our modern human-made world, just the fact that you can walk into a building and it doesn't collapse on us is a tribute to the people who made it and the people who funded them and regulated them and the people that taught them. There's like this whole edifice of love that's apparent all the time that we can forget about. And during times that feel dark, one of the antidotes is gratitude. And just in these simple things, I feel extraordinary gratitude. And it reminds me of how overall there's been so much success in the project of science and technology. It's so easy to lose sight of that. And yet there is something really screwy going on that seems to me to be fairly distinct from previous problems. It's a new, sneaky problem we've brought upon ourselves, and we have yet to fully invent our way out of it. So, what exactly is going on? I think at a most fundamental level, we've created a way of managing information among ourselves that detaches us from reality. I think that is the most serious problem. If the only problem was that our technology makes us at times more batty, more irritable, paranoid, more mean-spirited, more separated, more lonely, if that kind of problem was what we were talking about, that would be important, it would be serious, it would be important to address it. But what really scares me about the present moment is that I fear we've lost the ability to have a societal conversation about actual reality, about things like climate change, the need to have adequate food and water for peak population, which is coming, the need for dealing with changes in the profile of diseases that are coming. There's so many issues are real. They're not just fantasy issues. They're existential, real issues. Climate above all. And the question is, are we still able to have a conversation about reality or not? That becomes the existential question of the moment. And so far, the way we've been running things has been pulling us away from reality. That scares me, and I think that's the core darkness that we have to address. We can survive everything else, but we cannot survive if we fail to address that. Now, in the title of this lecture, I promised a little bit of history, how the internet got screwed up or something like that. So I'll tell you a bit about that. But I want to focus more on trying to characterize this issue a little more tightly and trying to explain at least my thoughts on how to remedy it, and maybe some other people's thoughts too, try to give you a bit of a sense of it. Now, to begin with, one of the infuriating aspects of our current problem is that it was well foreseen in advance. That's the thing about it. Nobody can claim that they were surprised. And I can point to many folks who were talking about this in advance. As good a starting place as any is to talk about E.M. Forster's story, The Machine Stops. Who here has read it? Okay, well, a few people. Terrifying, right? All right, The Machine Stops was written, I believe, in 1907. Is that right? It might have been 09. But, a century and a decade ago or so. And it foresees a world remarkably like ours. It's a world, and this was written well before Turing, well before any of this stuff. I mean, before there was computation. And it describes a world of people in front of their screens, interacting, social networking, doing search, and getting lost in a bunch of stupid bullshit. And finally, when the machine experiences a crash, there's this calamity on Earth, and people become so dependent on it that the loss of this machine becomes a calamity in itself. And at the very end of the book, people are crawling out from their screens and looking at the real world and saying, oh my God, the sun. And it's like this, it's a really amazing piece because it's possibly the most prescient thing that's ever been written at all. It was written in part as a response to the techie utopianism of the day. It was a response to writers like H.G. Wells saying, wait a second, these are still going to be people. We have to think about what this will mean to people. It's often the case that the first arriver on a scene has a clearer view and can have this kind of lucidity that later people find it very difficult to achieve. And I think something like that happens very long ago. But then, honestly, we could talk about Turing's last writing just before his suicide, where he was realizing that even though he played as great a role as anyone in defeating fascism, he hadn't defeated fascism at all, because here he was being destroyed for his identity. You all know the story of Turing. By now, it's not obscure anymore. There was a movie and everything. For a long time, I would speak to computer science classes, and nobody knew about Turing's death at all, which is a scandal. But at this point, I think everyone knows. And if you read his final writings, you read this kind of, in a way, an inner glow of somebody who does have some kind of a faith and some kind of a stronger center, but also this kind of sense of defeat. And by the way, it's within the context of that he invented artificial intelligence, that he invented the Turing test and this notion of this person who would transcend, this non-person who could transcend sexuality and be just this pristine, abstract, Platonic being and escape oppression, perhaps. But anyway, so we have that. In the immediate early generation of computer scientists, we had Norbert Wiener. Who here has read Norbert Wiener? I don't see a single young person's hand up, I don't think. If you're young, if you're a student and you haven't read any of these people, would you please correct that and read them? Seriously, you'll be so happy if you take this advice and actually read these people. So Norbert Wiener's one of the very first computer scientists. first generation, and he wrote books that were incredibly prescient about this. He wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and he pointed out if you could attach a computer to input and output devices interacting with a person, you could get algorithms that would enact adaptive behavior technologies to take control of the person. And he viewed this as this extraordinary moral failure that to be avoided. And he has this thought experiment at the end of the book where he says, well, you could imagine some kind of global system where everybody would have devices on them attached to such algorithms that would be manipulating them in ways they couldn't quite follow. And this would bring humanity to a disastrous end. But of course, this is only a thought experiment. No such thing is feasible because there wouldn't be enough bandwidth on the radio waves and all this. You know, he then explained why it couldn't be done. And of course, we built exactly the thing he warned about. I could give many other examples. I worked on it myself. In '92, I wrote an essay describing how little AI bots could create fake social perception in order to confuse people and throw elections. Big deal. Lots of people were prescient about this. This wasn't a surprise. We knew. And that's the thing that's so depressing. There was a lot of good cautionary science fiction. There were a lot of good cautionary essays. There were good cautionary technical writings. And we ignored all of it. We ignored it all. How could that have happened? So I would rather tell the story about how everybody was surprised. And a lot of people who are entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were surprised, but only because they don't like reading. Don't be like them. So the social history of how everything screwed up is a reasonable way to talk about the particular way in which it's screwed up. So I'm going to give it a try. The first thing to say is that in the generation of media technologists and artists and viewers from immediately before computation went pop in like the 60s into the 70s into the 80s, some of the personality dysfunctions and some of the craziness was already apparent. We started to see this notion that anybody could be a celebrity, and people became obsessed with this idea that maybe I could be one and maybe there's something wrong with me if I'm not, and this kind of mass media insecurity obsession thing. It's hard to trace the moment when this personality dysfunction really hit the mainstream and really started to darken the world. We were talking earlier actually about what moment to choose. I was thinking actually the assassination of John Lennon, because here you had somebody who basically just wanted to be famous for being able to be a random killer, and that was a little new. If you look at crappy evil people earlier, sure, there were some who wanted to be famous, I don't know, Bonnie and Clyde or something like that, but there are a few different things about them. One thing is that they were also stealing money. There was a kind of a way in which they were, I don't know, there was some kind of a part of a system. They had peers. They weren't typically total loners. The most typical profile of a really evil person before was actually a hyperconformist. The typical Nazi was actually somebody who didn't want to stand out, who just was going with the flow and fully internalized the social milieu around them, and because it felt normal. And that's been the much more typical way that people behaved appallingly in history. This sort of weird loner celebrity seeker thing, I'm sure it existed before, but it started to become prominent. I want to say something I've never said publicly before, but it's just been gnawing at me for many years. I'm old enough to have had some contact back in the day with both Marshall McLuhan and Andy Warhol, who were two figures who had a kind of a lucid way of talking about this early, but they didn't condemn it. They just stood aloof and said, oh, we're super smart and wise for being able to see this happening. And what they should have done is they should have said, this is shit. And it's actually really been bothering me. I've never said that before. I feel it should be said. Because once again, the first people on the scene sometimes have a kind of a vision, and they should be judgmental about it, the way E.M. Forster was. And I feel like they maybe failed us morally at that point, because they saw it better than a lot of other people, maybe than anybody at that time. Anyway, that's maybe not useful to say now, but at some point it has to be said. Let's fast forward a little bit. computation starts to get cheap enough that it's starting to creep out of the lab. This is the early 1980s. And here we hit another juncture. There was this thing that happened. Oh man, I was right there for it. It was the birth of the open free software idea. There was a friend of mine named Richard Stallman. Richard, I wonder if, any chance Richard's here? No, I guess not. Anyway, you never know. Once in a while, he'll show up at things. Anyway, Richard had this horrible, one day he just started saying, oh my God, my girlfriend's been killed, my lover's been killed. It's like, oh my God, that's horrible. But what it really was the software system he'd been working on for this kind of computer, and what had happened is it had gone into a commercial mode where the companies, it was a thing called the Lisp machine, which probably nobody remembers anymore, a sort of early attempt to make an AI specialized computer. And he was so upset, he said, he sort of melded his anger about this with a kind of an anti-capitalist feeling. He said, no, software must be free, it must be just this thing that's distributed, it can't be property, property is theft. And it really spoke to a lot of people. It melded with these other ideas that were going on at the time. And so it became this kind of feeling, I would say sort of a leftist feeling that was profound and remains to this day. A lot of times if somebody wants to do something useful with tech, they'll have to put in the word open source. Lately, they also have to put in blockchain. And so very typically there'll be something, it's open source, it's got blockchain. And then you know it's good. So there was this other thing going on, which was this feeling that the purpose of computers was to hide. And that deserves a little bit of explanation. America's always had this divide, this red-blue divide or whatever. Remember, it used to be a north-south divide. We fought one of history's horrible wars once as a civil war. And so people on what we'd call now the red side of the divide were very upset. There was a Democratic president named Jimmy Carter that a few people other than me in the room might be old enough to remember. And there was a period when there was an Arab oil embargo, and we had long lines at gas stations, and he imposed a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on the freeways, which a lot of people really hated because they wanted to drive fast. And so this thing sprang up called CB radio. And CB radios were these little analog radios you'd install in your car, and you'd create a false persona, a handle, and then you'd warn other people about where the police were hiding so that you could all drive fast collectively by sharing information. And it was all anonymous, so you could never trace it. And this thing was huge. This had as high a profile at the time as Twitter does today, probably. There were songs celebrating it. It was a really big deal. But then on the left side of America, on the blue side, people also wanted to hide. And in that case, there were two things going on. One is the draft hadn't quite died down, and it was still the Vietnam era, and that was just terrifying because people didn't really believe in that war, and the idea of being drafted into this horribly violent war that appeared to have no good purpose just absolutely broke people's hearts and terrified people, so they wanted to hide, and a lot of people did. And then there was marijuana and the drug laws. And a lot of people really were hiding from those as well. So you basically had both red and blue America feeling like the number one priority for freedom, for goodness, is to be able to hide from the government. So encryption and hiding and fake personas became this celebrated thing. So in this milieu, there was this idea that online networking, which didn't really exist yet. I mean, we had networks, but they were all very specialized and isolated. There wasn't a broad internet yet. There would be this idea that everything would be free and open, everything would be anonymous, and it would just be like this giant, black, weird place where you never knew anything, but you were also free and nobody could find you. Okay, so that was this starting idea. There were a few other things that fed into it. Another thing was that there was a famous rock band called the Grateful Dead that encouraged people to tape their songs and didn't care about piracy and all this. There were all these different factors. Now, all of this was going on, and then simultaneously this other thing happened, which is we started to have the figure of the glorified, practically superhuman tech entrepreneur. And these were in the 80s. These were figures like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, people we still remember, of course. Bill's still with us. And they were just worshipped. They were the coolest people ever. Well, around here in California, people hated Bill, but they loved Steve. And there was this kind of interesting problem, which is we didn't just like our tech entrepreneurs, we made them into sort of superhuman figures. The phrase "dent the universe" is associated with Jobs. It's this notion that there's this kind of Nietzschean superpower to create the flow of reality, to direct the future, because you're the tech entrepreneur, and computation is reality, and the way we set these architectures will create future societies, and that'll ultimately change the shape of the universe once we get even greater powers over physics. And there was just like this no end to the fantastical thinking. We were at the birth point for every form of absolute godlike, immortality and shape-shifting and every crazy thing. I was a little bit of that. I'm sorry to say I kind of got a little off. I was pretty intense in the 80s myself. But anyway, there was this feeling that the entrepreneur could had more cosmic power than the average person. Okay, so now here you have a dilemma that had been kind of sneaking up and nobody had really faced it. On the one hand, everything's supposed to be free, everything's supposed to be anonymous, everything is supposed to be like this completely open thing. But on the other hand, we love our entrepreneurs, we worship our entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs are inventing reality. So it should be clear that there's a bit of a potential conflict here. Everything must be free, but we worship entrepreneurs. How do we do it? How do we do it? How do we do it? And so a set of compromises were created over the years that ended up giving us the worst of both sides of that, I would say. So I'll give you, the story is long and interesting, but I'll give you just a few highlights. One thing that happened is when we finally got around to actually creating the internet, we decided it had to be super bare bones. It would represent machines, because without having a number representing a machine, you can't have an internet, but it wouldn't represent people. It didn't intrinsically have accounts built in for humans. It had no storage for humans built in. It had no transactions. It had no authentication. It had no persistence of information guaranteed. It had no historical function. It was like super bare bones. Just this thing connects with that thing. That's all it did. And the reason why was that we were supposed to leave room for future entrepreneurs, those who we worshiped. Now, the internet, so if I was about to say the internet, as you know, was invented by Al Gore, some of you would laugh. And that's because it was a laugh line for a while, because he was a Democratic, he was a vice president, and before that a senator from Tennessee, and he was accused of overclaiming that he'd invented the internet on a TV show, which didn't happen. However, I think he should claim it. I think he did invent it. He didn't invent it technologically, not at all. All of the underlying stuff, which is called a packet switch network and a few other elements, that existed in lots of instances from before. He had this idea of throwing some government money into it to bribe everybody to become interoperable, so there'd just be one damn network and people could actually connect. That really was him, and he deserves credit for having done that, unless you think it was a terrible idea. But when that was happening, I remember having conversations about it. It's like, by creating this thing in such an incredibly bare bones way, we are creating gifts of hundreds of billions of dollars for persons unknown who will be required to fill in these missing things that everybody knows have to be filled in. And then a little while later, this other thing happened, which is Tim Berners-Lee, who's great, came up with the World Wide Web Protocol. And here, he did this thing. Up to that point, all of the ideas for how to create shareable media experiences online, which are called hypertext, after Ted Nelson, who'd come up with the first network design back in 1960. The HTTP is for hypertext. A core tenet of these is that anytime one thing on the internet pointed at something else, that other thing had to know it was being pointed at, so that there were two-way links. You always knew who was pointing at you. And the reason for that is that way you could preserve context, provenance, history. You could create chains of payment where if people mashed up stuff from somebody else and that person mashed up from somebody else, you could create payments that would populate back to pay for everybody who contributed. So if you wanted to have an economy of information, you could. The information wouldn't be dropped. But Tim just had one-way links. You could point at somebody, they had no idea they were being pointed at. And the reason for that is that it's just, to actually do the two-way links is genuinely a pain in the butt. It's just more work. If you do one-way links, the whole thing could spread a lot faster. Anybody can do it. It's just a much easier system. And that embedded in it not only this idea of virality or meminess, where whatever can spread the fastest is what wins. And so it was a quantity over quality thing in my view. That was another thing that happened. So, another thing that happened didn't come from Silicon Valley. In the late 80s, people in Wall Street started to use automated trading, and the first flash crash from out-of-control trading algorithms was '89. And they figured out something very basic, although E.M. Forster had described exactly this problem so much earlier, which is that if you had a bigger computer than everybody else and it was more central, getting more information, you could calculate ahead of everybody and gain an information advantage. And in economics, information advantage is everything. So if you had just a little bit more information than everybody else, you could just turn that into money. And it wasn't really new insight, but it had actually been implemented before. Then shortly after that, a company called Walmart realized they could apply that not just to financial instruments and to investments, but to the real world. And they created a software model of their supply chain and dominated it. They could go to anybody who was involved somewhere in giving them products and figure out what their bottom line was, so they could negotiate everybody down. They knew who everybody's competitor was. They went into every negotiation with superior information, and they built this giant retail empire on information superiority. That all happened before anybody in Silicon Valley started doing it. Okay, now fast forward to the birth of Google. So you have these super bright kids, Sergey and Larry. Some of the students I talked to today on campus here remind me of what they were like at the same age. Super bright, super optimistic, idealistic actually, focused. And they were backed into a corner in my view. On the one hand, the whole hacker community, the whole tech community would have just slammed them if they did anything other than everything being free. But on the other hand, everybody wanted them to be the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates. That was like practically a hunger, like we want our next star. And the only way to combine the two things was the advertising model. The advertising model would say, you'll get everything for free. You can be, as far as you're concerned, your experience is you just ask for what you want and we give it to you. Now, the problem with that is that because it's an advertising thing, you're actually being observed. Your information is being taken, you're being watched, and there's a true customer, this other person off to the side, who at first you were always aware of because you could see their little ads, they're like if you're a local dentist or whatever. It was cute at first, it was harmless at first. And unfortunately, if they'd come up with this thing after, Moore's Law had ended and computers were as fast as they were ever going to get, and we'd established a whole regulatory and ethical substrate for computation and everything, maybe it could have worked. But instead, they did it in a period where there was still a whole lot of Moore's Law to happen. So all the computers got faster and faster, cheaper and cheaper, more and more plentiful, more and more storage, more and more connection. The algorithms got better and better. Machine learning kind of started to work a little better. A lot of these algorithms kind of figured it out. We had enough computation to do experiments and get all kinds of things working that hadn't worked before. All kinds of little machine vision things. I sold them a machine vision company, actually. And the whole thing kind of accelerated, and what started out as an advertising model turned into something very different. And so here we get into our description of at least my perception of the state that we're in right now. So I mentioned earlier that Norbert Wiener had described what he viewed as a potentially horrible outcome for the future of computation, where you'd have a computer in real time observing a person with sensors and providing stimulus to that person in some form with displays or other effectors, and implementing behavior modification feedback loops in order to influence the person. And if that was done globally, it would detach humanity from reality and bring our species to an end. That was the fear back in the 50s. Now, Unfortunately, this innocent little advertising model, which was supposed to address both the desire to have everything be this Wild West open thing and the desire to have entrepreneurs, despite everything being free, landed us right in that pocket. That's exactly where we went. Now, I should say a bit about behaviorism, because that's another historical thread that led to where we are. Behaviorism is a discipline of reducing the number of variables in the training of an organism so that you can characterize them rigorously and reproduce effects. So let's say if you're whispering into your horse's ear while you're training your horse, that's not behaviorism. If you're whispering into your kid's ear, even if you do offer some treats once in a while to encourage behavior, that's not behaviorism. It has elements of it. But hardcore behaviorism reduces the variables and it says, look, what we want to do, if we want to isolate, we want to say, here's this organism, it's in a box. Sometimes they're called Skinner boxes, remembering B.F. Skinner, one of the famous behaviorists. And we want to say, if the creature, person, human, whatever, does a certain thing you want, you give the person a treat. Does something you don't want, give them a punishment, typically maybe candy and electric shock. The timing and the occurrence of these things is guided by an algorithm. You fine-tune the algorithm and you need to discover how to change behavior patterns. This science of studying behaviorism yielded surprises, really interesting surprises. Very early on, the first celebrity behaviorist was probably Pavlov. You've all heard of Pavlov, I'm sure. And he demonstrated famously that he could get a dog to salivate upon hearing a bell, whereas previously the dog salivated upon being given food and hearing the bell. So he was able to create a purely symbolic stimulus to replace the original concrete one. That's quite important because in many areas today where behavior is modified and addictions are created, they're only abstract stimuli. This is true, for instance, for gambling. So modern gambling is based on this. So are like little games like Candy Crush, where they have pictures of candy instead of real candy. Now, I have no doubt someday there'll be some Facebook or Google hovercraft, drone over your head that drops real candy and electric shocks on your head. But for the moment, we're in this symbolic realm that Pavlov uncovered. Another amazing result is that you might think naively that simply providing punishment and reward as reliably and as immediately as possible would be the most effective way to change behavior patterns, but actually that's not true. It turns out that adding an element of randomness makes the algorithms more effective. We don't fully, just to state the obvious, nobody really understands the brain as yet, but it appears that the brain is constantly in a natural state of seeking patterns, of trying to understand the world. So if you provide a slightly randomized feedback pattern, it doesn't confuse or repel the brain, instead it draws the brain in. The brain is thinking, oh, there must be something more to understand, there must be something more, and gradually you're drawn in more and more and more. And so this is why the randomness of when you win at gambling is actually part of the addiction algorithm. That's part of what makes it happen. Now, in the case of social media, what happens is the reward is when you get retweeted or you go viral, something like that. The term of art in Silicon Valley companies is usually a dopamine hit, which is not an entirely accurate description, but it's the one that's most commonly used for when you have a quick rise of a positive reward. But just as the gambler becomes addicted to the whole cycle where they're losing more often than they win, a Twitter addict gets addicted to the whole cycle where they're most often being punished by other people who are tweeting, and they only get a win once in a while, right? It's the same algorithm. And indeed, one of the side effects in the trade, the terminology we use is engagement. We have algorithms that drive engagement. And we hire zillions of people with recent PhDs from psych departments. There's a program called Persuasive Technology at Stanford where you can go get a PhD in this, and then you get hired by some tech company to drive engagement. But it's really just a sanitized word for addiction. So we drive addiction using a variety of these algorithms, and we can study them more than the classical behaviorists ever did because we can study 100 million instances at once, and we can put out 100 million variations on all kinds of people and correlate it with data for all those people, and then cycle and cycle and cycle. The algorithms can find new pockets of efficacy. They can tweak themselves until they work better, and we don't even know why. They're far ahead of any ability we have to really keep up with them and try to interpret exactly why some things work better than other things. Now, even so, it's important to get this right. The effect is, in a way, not that dramatic. So Facebook, for instance, has published research bragging that it can make people sad, and they don't realize that they were made sad by Facebook. Now, by the way, you might wonder, why would Facebook publish that? Wouldn't they want to hide that fact? It sounds pretty bad. But you have to remember that you're not the customer of Facebook. The customer is the person off to the side. We've created a world in which anytime two people connect online, it's financed by a third person who believes they can manipulate the first two. So to the degree Facebook can convince that third party, that mysterious other who's hoping to have influence, that they can have some mystical, magical, unbounded, sneaky form of influence, then Facebook makes more money. That's why they published it. And I've been at events where this stuff is sold by the various tech companies, and there's no end to the brags and the exaggerations when it comes to telling the true customers what their powers are. Very different from their public stance. But at any rate, the darkness of this all is that when you use this technique to addict people, and we haven't even got to the final stage of influencing their behavior patterns, we're still just at the first stage of getting them addicted, you create personality dysfunctions associated with addiction because it is a form of behavioral addiction. So if any of you have ever dealt with somebody who's a gambling addict, the technical qualities of gambling addiction are similar to the technical qualities of social media addiction. Now, I was just saying before that we have to get this right and understand the degree of awfulness here, because it's actually kind of slight, but just very consistent and distributed. A gambling addiction can be really ruinous. Somebody can destroy their lives and their family. A social media addiction can be ruinous, as we've seen by unfortunate events in just the last few days. But more often, there's a statistical distribution where a percentage of people are kind of slightly affected and have their personality slightly changed. So what'll happen is some percentage, and in some of the studies I've seen published, maybe it's like 5% show like a 3% change in personality or something like that. So, and this is over hundreds of millions of people or even over billions. So it's a very slight, very distributed statistical effect on people with just a few who are really dramatically affected. But the problem with that is that it compounds like compound interest. A slight effect that's persistent, consistent, repeated starts to darken the whole society. So let's talk a little bit about the addictive personality that's brought out by these things. The way I characterize it is it becomes paranoid, insecure, a little sadistic. It becomes cranky. Now, why? Why those qualities? So I have a hypothesis about this, and here I'm hypothesizing a little ahead of experimental results in science. So I want to make that clear. This is a conjecture, not something that I can cite direct evidence for. But all the components of it are all well studied. So it's just putting together things that are known, and I think this should therefore be worthy of public discussion. You can very roughly bundle emotional responses from people into two kind of bins. One we'll call positive and the other we'll call negative. The positive ones are things like affection, trust, optimism in a person, belief in a person, faith in a person, comfort with a person, relaxing around a person, all that kind of stuff. The qualities you want to feel in yourself when you're dating somebody, let's say. The negative ones are things like fear, anger, jealousy, rage, feeling aggrieved, feeling a need for revenge, just all this stuff. Now, in the negative bin, a lot of these emotions are similar to another bin that's been described over many years, which is the startle responses or the fight or flight responses. And the thing about these negative ones is that they rise quickly and they take a while to fall. So you can become scared really fast. You can become angry really fast. And the related positive emotions tend to rise more slowly, but can drop quickly. They have the reverse time profile. So it's takes a long time to build trust, but you can lose trust very quickly. It takes a long time to become relaxed compared to how quickly you can become startled, scared, and nervous and on edge. Now, this isn't universally true. There are some fast-rising positive emotions. I just talked about the dopamine hits earlier, so that's an exception. But overall, there are more fast-rising negative ones. Now, these algorithms that are measuring you all the time in order to adapt the customized feeds that you see and the designs of the ads that you see and just everything about your experience, they're watching you in a zillion ways, expanding all the time. Now they're following your voice tone and trying to discern things about your emotions based on pure correlation without necessarily much theory behind it. They're watching your motions as you move. They're watching your eyes, your smile. And of course, they're watching what you click on, what you type, all that. And the thing is, if you have an emotional response that's faster, the algorithms are going to pick up on it faster because they're trying to get as much speed as possible. They're rather like high-frequency trading algorithms in that sense. We intrinsically, in Silicon Valley, try to make things that respond quickly and act quickly. And so if you have a system that's responding to the fast-rising emotions, you'll tend to catch more of the negative ones. You'll tend to catch more of the startle emotions. Now, here's the thing. If you look at the literature and ask the broad question, if we accept this idea of binning emotions into positive and negative feedback emotions, as far as behavior change goes, is positive or negative more influential on human behavior? And the answer you'll get is a really complex patchwork. Behaviorism's been around for a long time, so there's a lot of studies you can read. Hard to know exactly how high quality all the research is, especially the older stuff, but in general you can find lots of examples of positive feedback working better than negative or vice versa, and it's all very situational. A lot of it's very subtle on how things are framed for people, all kinds of stuff. But overall, what I perceive from the literature is an approximate parity between positive and negative. But if you ask which emotions will the algorithms pick up on when they're trying to get the fastest possible feedback, it's unquestionably true that the negative ones are faster. All right, so what you see is the algorithm suddenly flagging, oh my God, I got a rise out of that person. Let's do some more of that because we're engaging that person. And that stuff tends to be the stuff that makes them angry, paranoid, revengeful, insecure, nervous, jealous, all these things. And so what you see is this feedback cycle where a certain kind of dysfunctional personality trait is brought out more and more, and people with similar dysfunctional personalities are introduced to each other by the systems. So what does a personality look like? Well, the addiction personality online, I'll name 3 people who have recently displayed it rather blatantly. One is the president, who I'm just not going to bother to name because I'm sick of the idiot. The second is Kanye. The third is Elon Musk. 3 people, all displaying somewhat overlapping, in my view, personality distortions. Now, I've had slight contact with 2 of the above 3. I'll let you guess which 2 they are. Well, no, I'll say one of them's Trump. I've met Trump a few times over a very long period of time. I've never known him well. I've never had a real conversation with him, but I will say that in the 80s and 90s, he didn't seem like somebody who was desperate for you to like him. He didn't seem like somebody who was nervous about what you thought about him. He didn't seem like somebody who was itching for a fight. He didn't seem like somebody who was looking for trouble and thought it would help him. He really just didn't seem like that at all. I think he was still a con man. But he was kind of like a happy con man. It was like a different persona. And I think remember how I said before that the gambling addict is addicted to the whole cycle where they lose a lot before they win? And I think in the same way, the Twitter addict is addicted to a cycle where they bring a lot of wrath upon themselves and have to deal with a lot of negative feedback before they get positive feedback. Or that, there's a mix. It's very much like the losing and winning and gambling. And so I think what's happened is he's gotten himself into this state where he's like this really nervous narcissist. And this is kind of weird. Like, this personality of the person who really, does Putin really like me? I think he likes me. This kind of weird, nervous, narcissistic, insecure person has not been a typical authoritarian personality in the past. And yet it's working now. And I suspect the reason why is a lot of the followers who respond to it see themselves in that insecurity, which is really strange. I mean, if you think about this, in the past, the celebrity figure or the leader typically wanted to display a personality that was kind of invulnerable and aloof and unneeding, self-sufficient, uncaring about whether they're liked or not. And yet that's not what's going on here. It's really strange. And then this issue of lashing out, it's as if because you know that you have to get there's a certain amount of punishment that goes with that reward, you actually seek out some of the punishment because that's actually a part of your addiction. So if you're a gambling addict, you actually make some stupid bets. It's true. It's just what happens. So you have Elon Musk calling this guy who tried to rescue kids in a cave in Thailand a pedophile out of nowhere. All right, same thing. Twitter addiction, dysfunctional personality. Kanye, I'm not even, but basically you have people who are kind of degrading themselves and making themselves into fools, but in a funny way, in the current environment, there's a whole world of addicted fans who actually relate to it, see themselves in it, and it works. It works for the first time in history, and it's really strange. It's a really weird moment. Okay, so I started by talking about the problem of losing touch with reality. Now, as you heard, I have a book called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts right now, and it goes through a lot of reasons to delete your social media, of which the closest to my heart is actually the final one, which is a spiritual one. It's about how I think that Silicon Valley is kind of creating a new religion to replace old religions and even atheism with this new faith about AI and the superiority of tech and how we're creating the future and all this. And I feel that religion is an inferior one and people are being drawn into it through practice. So that 10th argument is the one I care most about. But what I want to focus on here is the existential argument, which is the loss of reality. So the problem we have here is that we've created so many addicts, so many people who are on edge, that they perceive essentially politics before they perceive nature. They perceive the world of human recriminations before they perceive actual physical reality. Now, I've presented a theory in various of my books called the pack switch, which I will recount to you now. That's a way of thinking about this. It goes like this. There's some species that are intrinsically social, like a lot of ants. There's some species that tend to be solitary, like a lot of octopuses, which are some of my favorite animals. There are some species that can switch, that can be either solitary or social, depending on circumstances. And A famous one that we refer to in mythology and in our storytelling is the wolf. You can have a wolf pack, or you can have a lone wolf. Same wolves, different social structures, different epistemology, I would say. When you're a lone wolf, you're responsible for your own survival. You have to pay attention to your environment. Where will you find water? Where will you find prey? How do you avoid being attacked? Where do you find shelter? How do you survive bad weather? You are attached to reality like a scientist or like an artist. You are a naturalist. When you're in a wolf pack, different story. Now you have to worry about your peers. They're competing with you. You have to worry about those above you in the pack. Will they trash you? Will you get their station? You have to piss on those below you because you have to maintain your status. But you have to unify with all your fellow pack members to oppose those other packs over there, the other. So all of a sudden, social perception in politics has replaced naturalism. Politics versus naturalism. Those are the epistemologies of the lone wolf and the wolf pack. People are also variable in exactly this way. We can function as individuals, or we can function as members of a pack. Now, what happens is exactly what I am at least hypothesizing happens with wolves. It's been kind of interesting interacting with scientists who actually study wolves, because I haven't actually spent that much time with wolves, just a little bit. So there are people who know a lot more about wolves. And let's just say my little portrayal is overly simplified, but just it's like a little cartoon, but I hope it functions to communicate. So when we are thinking as individuals, we have a chance to be naturalists. We have a chance to be scientists and artists. We have a chance to perceive reality uniquely from our own unique perspective, a diverse perspective as compared to everyone else's that we can then share. When we join into a pack mentality, we perceive politics. So what happens on social media is because the algorithms are trying to get a rise out of you to up your engagement and make you ripe for receiving behavior modification, you're constantly being pricked with little social anxiety, rage, irritations, all these little things, all these little status worries. Is my life as good as that person's life? Am I lonely relative to all these people? What do they think of me? Am I smart enough? Am I getting enough attention for this? Why didn't people care about the last thing I did online? Blah, 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 blah. And there's just like, it's not that any of these things by themselves are necessarily that serious, but cumulatively what they're doing is they're shifting your mindset. And suddenly you're thinking like a pack creature. The pack switch is set. And you're thinking politically. And when you think politically, you lose naturalism. Now, I think both modes of being have a place. I think if people exclusively all the time stayed in the lone setting, that would be bad for society. That would be bad for relationships. It would be bad for families, and so on. However, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be a healthy way of going back and forth between them and not getting lost in one or the other. And so the hypothesis I put forward is that we're giving people so many little anxiety-producing bits of feedback that we're getting them into this pack mentality where they've become hyper-political without maybe even quite realizing it and losing touch with reality. Now, when I say losing touch with reality, that demands some evidence because you might say, well, are we less in touch than in the past? So remember, at the start, after the music, I gave you what I consider to be sort of a positive framing and a lot of good news. Absolute poverty has been reduced, absolute levels of violence have been reduced, absolute levels of disease have been reduced, and so on. There are many ways in which we're bettering ourselves. But there's this other thing going on which is bad enough that it might be the undoing of all of that. And that is this loss of reality. Now, here's what I want to point out. I travel around a fair amount, and I visited places that would appear on the surface to have very little in common. I'll mention some of them. Brazil, Sweden, Turkey, Hungary, the United States. What do they all have in common? What they have in common is the rise, not just, we sometimes characterize it as right-wing populist politics. I don't think that's quite right. I think what we actually are seeing is the rise of cranky, paranoid, unreal politics. I think that's a better characterization. And it's really remarkable how it's all happened at about the same time. And it's happened in some poor parts of the world too. It's not even, it's like, so it's, you could say, well, it's something about aging populations and all the cranky old people. I have, freshmen will tell me that to get on my nerve. But, there are countries that are very young that have that problem. Turkey, Brazil. It's like, it's diverse countries. It's that we can't have democracies unless they're ethnically monolithic or something. Well, Brazil's diverse. It's inequality. We can't have, the problem is that societies are just losing their social safety net. Well, Sweden, Germany, not really. They might have anxiety about it, but actually, it's not so. All these places are really different. They have different histories. And yet, they've all had similar dysfunctions. And so you have to say, well, what's in common between all of them? And you could say something vague, well, they all have anxiety about the future and this, that's true. But the obvious thing they have in common is that people have moved to this mode of connecting through manipulative systems that are designed for the benefit of third parties who hope to manipulate everybody sneakily. That seems like the clear thing they all have in common. Brazil recently, all the same crap that we saw was happening on WhatsApp, which is the big connector down there. And Facebook, I think to their credit, tried to help a little bit, but they couldn't really do it because the whole system is designed to be manipulative. It's if you have a card that's designed to roll, it's very hard to say, well, we won't let it roll very much. Whatever it does, it'll be rolling. If you have a manipulation system, and that's what it's designed for, you can try to get it to roll more slowly or something, but all it can really do is manipulate. That is what these things are optimized for. That's what they're built for. That's how they make money. Every penny of the many billions of dollars that some of these companies have taken in that are totally dependent on this, and of the big companies, the only ones really totally dependent are Google and Facebook, or almost totally dependent. It all comes from people who believe they'll be able to sneakily influence somebody else by paying money to these places. That is what they do. There's just no other way to describe it. And so you have the typical thing that happens is that the algorithms, there isn't any information in them that comes from like angels or extraterrestrials. It all has to come from people. So people input some information, and often it's very positive at first. A lot of the starter information that goes into social networks ranges from extremely positive and constructive to just neutral and nothing much. So there might be people who are trying to better themselves. Maybe they're trying to help each other with health information or something like that. Then all this information starts, they'll say, well, we're going to forward some of this information to this person and that person. We'll try it 10 million times, and we'll see if we get a rise from anybody that ups their engagement. Now, the people who will be engaged, quote unquote engaged, are the ones who dislike that information. So all of a sudden, you're getting juice from finding exactly the horrible people who hate whatever the positive people started off with. And so this is why you see this phenomenon over and over again, where whenever somebody finds a great way to use a social network, they have this initial success, and then it's echoed later on by horrible people getting even more mileage out of the same stuff. So you start with an Arab Spring, and then you get ISIS getting even more mileage out of the same tools. You start with Black Lives Matter, you get these horrible racist these horrible people who just are blackening America getting even more mileage out of the same tools. It just keeps on happening. And by the way, you start with Me Too, and then you get incels and Proud Boys and whatever the next stupid thing's going to be. Because the algorithms are finding these people as a matter of course, introducing them to each other, and then putting them in feedback loops where they get more and more incited without anybody planning it. There's no evil person sitting in a cubicle intending this. Or at least I would be very surprised to find somebody like that. I know a lot of the people in the different places, and I just don't believe it. I believe that we backed ourselves into this weird corner, and we're just not able to admit it. And so we're just kind of stuck in this stupid thing where we keep on doing this to ourselves. So What you end up with is electorates that are driven, you have like enough of a percentage of people who are driven to be a little cranky and paranoid and a little irritated, and they might have legitimate reasons. I'm not saying that they're totally disconnected from real life complaints, but their way of framing it is based on whatever the algorithms found could be forwarded to them that would irritate them the most, which is a totally different criteria than reality. So whatever it is, and so if it's in the case of the synagogue shooter, it was one set of bullshit. In the case of the pipe bomber guy, it was another thing. In the case of the guy who shot up but it's all similar. It's all part of the same brew of stuff that algorithms forward. Now, in some cases, the algorithms might have tweaked the messages a bit, because the algorithms can do things like play with fonts and colors and timing and all kinds of parameters to try to, if those have a slight effect on how much of a rise they can get. But typically they come from people who are also just trying to get as much impact as possible. And I think what's happened is we've created a whole world of people who think that it's honorable to be a terribly socially insecure nitwit who feels that the world is against them and is desperate to get attention in any way. And if they can get that attention, that's the ultimate good. And the president acts that way. A lot of people act that way. That's what Musk was doing, and many other figures. And I think what happens is these people become both the source of new data that furthers the cycle, and of course it drives them. And so there's sort of multiple levels of evil that result from this. The obvious one is these horrible people who make our world unsafe and make our world violent and break our hearts and just keep on doing it over and over again. And this sense that just random people are self-radicalizing and turning themselves into the most awful version of a human imaginable. But there aren't that many of them in absolute numbers. And I said earlier, in terms of absolute amounts of violence, there's actually an overall decrease in the world, despite all this horrible stuff, with some notable exceptions, like with ISIS in the Middle East and so forth. But overall, actually, that's true. However, the second evil is the one that I think actually threatens our overall survival, and that is the one of gradually making it impossible to have a conversation about reality. It's really become impossible to have a conversation about climate. It's become impossible to have a conversation about health. It's become impossible to have a conversation about poverty. It's become impossible to have a conversation about refugees. It's become impossible to have a conversation about anything real. It's only become possible to have conversations about what the algorithms have found upsets people, and on the terms of upsetting, because that's the only thing that's allowed to matter. And that is terribly dark. That is terribly dark and terribly threatening. And the scenario I worry about is, it's conceivable that some sort of repeat of what happened, it's hard for me to even say this, but some sort of repeat of what happened in the late 30s in Germany could come about here. I can imagine that scenario. I can imagine it vividly because my own grandfather waited too late in Vienna, and my mother was taken as a child and survived a concentration camp. So I feel this very keenly, having a daughter myself. And yet, I don't think that's the most likely bad scenario here. I think the more likely bad scenario is that we just put up with more and more shootings, more and more absolutely useless, horrible people becoming successful in one theater or another, whether politicians or company heads or entertainers or whatever. And gradually, we don't address the climate. Gradually, we don't address where we're going to get our fresh water from. Gradually, we don't address where we're going to get our new antibiotics from. Gradually, we don't wonder how we're going to stop the spread of viruses. Vaccine paranoia is another one of these stupid things that's spread through these channels. Gradually, we see more and more young men everywhere turning themselves into the most jerky version of a young man, sort of various weenie supremacy movements under different names, from, Gamergate to incels to alt-right to Proud Boys to whatever. There's just going to be like this endless thing. And then gradually one day it's too late and we haven't faced reality and we no longer have agriculture, we no longer have our coastal cities, we no longer have a world that we can survive in. And that's, you know, it's a kind of what I worry about is a terribly stupid, cranky, undignified end to us. Not a big dramatic one. It's neither a whimper nor a bang, but just sort of a cranky rant. That could be our end. And is that a laugh line? I don't know. You guys are pretty dark. Anyway, what to do about it? So here, my characterization of the problem overlaps strongly with a lot of other people's characterizations of the problem. Mine is perhaps not identical to the problem as described by many others, but there's enough overlap that I think we have a shared, we meaning many people who hope to change us, have a shared sense of what's gone wrong. Now, the first thing I want to say in terms of optimism is, wow, is that better than things used to be? If I had been giving this talk even a few years ago, not long at all ago, I would have been giving the talk as a really radical fringe figure who was saying things that almost nobody accepted, who had lost friends over these ideas, and who was really kind of surviving on the basis of my technical abilities in my past rather than what I was saying presently because it was so unpopular. The last, especially since I would say like Brexit, Trump, but also just in general, like studies showing the horrible increase in suicides in teen girls, that scale with their social media use, all these horrible things that have come out. All of a sudden it's really different. In Silicon Valley, there are genuinely substantial movements among the people at the companies to try to change their act. Regulators, at least in Europe, are starting to get teeth and really look at it seriously. The tech companies are trying to find a way to get out of the manipulation game. They haven't necessarily succeeded. And not all of them are trying, but some of them are. And it's a different world. It's a world with a lot of people who are engaged. So now, having presented the problem as I see it, it's possible to talk about the solution. Now, a lot of folks feel the solution should be privacy rights. The European regulators are really into that. We had a major conference on that in Brussels last week where Tim Cook, who runs Apple, gave a fire-breathing talk that kind of sounded like a talk I might have given at some point in the past. I gave a talk there too, and I was feeling like, wow, I'm not the radical anymore. It's very strange. In a way, I kind of mourn the loss of radicalness, because some part of me likes being the person like at this outer edge, and now I'm not. And it's kind of like, oh God, I'm supposed to be the radical. But anyway, I think it's great that the Europeans are pushing for privacy. The theory behind that is that the harder it is for the manipulation machine to get at your data, the less it can manipulate. And the more maybe there's a chance for sanity. There's a peculiar race going on because the societies in Europe that support regulation and have regulators with teeth, which we really don't have much of in the US right now, are themselves under siege by the cranky political parties, who are sometimes called right-wing populists, but I think should be just called the crank parties. And the cranky parties might bring these societies down. So there's a race. Can the regulators influence the technology in time to preserve themselves, or will the technology destroy their politics before they have a chance? So that's a race going on right now. It's quite dramatic, and I wouldn't know how to handicap it. The privacy approach is hard because these systems are complicated. Like if I say, okay, here's click on this button to consent to using your data for this. Like, obviously you can't read that thing, and even if there's some kind of better regulation supporting you, it's just nobody understands it. Even the companies themselves don't understand their own data. They don't understand their own security. This whole thing is beyond all of us. Nobody's really doing it that well. Everybody's having data breaches and discovering suddenly that they were using data they didn't think they were using. That's happened repeatedly at Google and Facebook in particular. So I've advocated a different approach, which is instead of using regulators to talk about privacy, get lawyers and accountants to talk about lost value from your data being stolen. Now, I have several reasons for that. One is, I don't think we'll ever lose our accountants and our lawyers. I think they're more persistent than our regulators. That's one reason. And I'm not going to do lawyer jokes because the whole society has become so mean-spirited. I don't like to make jokes about classes of people, even lawyers, anymore. But so my best friends are really, them. But anyway. Let me give you an example that I like to use to explain the economic approach here. There's a tool online that I happen to use frequently that I really like, which is automatic translation between languages. If you want to look at a website in another language or send somebody a note, you can go online, and there are at least two companies that do this pretty well now, Microsoft and Google. You can enter your text in one language, a usable translation comes out on the other side, convenient, free, great, modernity. However, here's an interesting thing. It turns out that languages are alive. Every single day there's a whole world of public events. All of a sudden today I have to be able to talk about the Tree of Life shooter and you have to know what I mean. All of a sudden today I have to be able to talk about the MAGA bomber, you need to know what I mean. So every single day there are all of these new reference points that come out. Lately often horrible ones, sometimes nice ones, maybe a new music video, a new meme that people like, whatever. So every single day, those of us who help maintain such systems have to scrape, meaning steal, tens of millions of example phrase translations from people who don't know it's being done to them. So there are tens of millions of people who are kind of tricked into somehow translating this phrase or that phrase, and Google and Microsoft have to grab these things and incorporate them to update their systems to make them work. But at the same time, the people who are good at translating are losing their jobs. The career prospects for a typical language translator have been decimated, meaning they're a tenth of what they were, following exactly the pattern of other information-based work that's been destroyed by the everything must be free movement. Recording musicians, investigative journalists, crucially, photographers, all of these people are looking at about a tenth of the career prospects that they used to have. That's not to say that everything's bleak. There are examples in each case of a few people who find their way. And this gets to a very interesting technical discussion, which is, I won't go into it, but you get a zip curve where there are a few successful people and then it falls to nothing, whereas before you had a bell curve. But I can, if anybody wants to know more about that, I can. But anyway, you have a tiny number of successful people, but almost everybody's lost their careers. Now, wouldn't it make more sense if, instead of making money by providing free translations in order to get other people who are called advertisers to manipulate the people who need the translations in some sneaky way that they don't understand and make the whole world more cranky and less reality-oriented, instead of that, what if we went to the people providing the phrase translations and we just told them, if you could just give us the phrase translations we really need, then our system would work better. And we'd pay you, because then we'd have a better system. And then if we went to the people who need translations and say, free isn't really quite working, because that means we have to get these other people to manipulate you to have a customer. But we'll make it really cheap. What about a dime a translation or something like that? And we work out some kind of a system where the people who provide the translations meet each other, because it's a network, we can introduce them. They form a union, they collectively bargain with us for reasonable rates that they can all live, put their kids through school, and then we get better working translators, and you pay a dime, you can afford a dime, and suddenly everybody's happier. Now, there are a few things about this that are really good in my point of view. One is we no longer have these people from the side paying to manipulate people. Everything's become clear. Two, we have a whole class of people making a living instead of needing to go on the dole. instead of saying, oh, we need this basic income because everybody's worthless. 3, we're being honest instead of lying, which is a really big deal. Right now, we have to lie because we're not telling the people that we're taking their data. We're telling them, oh, you're buggy whips, you're worthless, but in secret, we need you. That's a lie. And 4, there's kind of a spiritual thing here where we're telling people honestly when they're still needed. Like to tell people, oh, actually, you're obsolete. The robot's taken over your job, when it's not true, when we still need their data. There's something very cruel about that. It cuts to some sort of issue of dignity and human worth, and it really bothers me. So for all these reasons, this seems like a better system to me. And sure, we'd have to make accommodations for those who can't afford whatever the rate would be for language translation, but we can do that. We've always figured out ways to do that if we're a decent society. And we'd be a more decent society because we wouldn't have an economy that's strictly run on making people into assholes. So that's why I advocate the economic approach. So I know it's bad form, but can I refer you to a paper to read? Go look up something called Blueprint for a Better Digital Society. I'm sorry about the title. I didn't make it up. It's an editor's fault. Adi Ignatius, it's your fault, Adi. And it's a Harvard Business Review recently. You can find it online very easily. Blueprint for a Better Digital Society. And it's the latest version about how to make this thing work and a little bit about how to transition to it. So that's the solution I've been exploring and promoting. I think there's room for a lot of solutions. Another idea is people like the Center for Humane Technology, which is Tristan Harris, and another group called Common Sense Media are trying to educate individuals about how to be more aware of how they're manipulated and how to make slight adjustments to be manipulated a little less. Worth trying. Remember, it's a sneaky machine. The whole industry is based on fooling you, so staying ahead of it is going to be work. You can't just do it once and think you're done. It'll be a lifetime effort. That's why I think you should just quit the things. Now, when I say, can you please delete all your social media accounts, surely one of the first thoughts in all your minds is, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, you're not going to get billions of people to suddenly drop these things. There's 2 reasons why you're correct if you have that thought. One is that you're addicted. This is an actual addiction. You can't just go to somebody with a gambling addiction and say, oh, just say no, any more than you can do that if they have a heroin addiction. That's not how addiction works. You can't just say no. It's hard. Addiction's hard. All of us have addictions. None of us are perfect. But this particular one's destroying our future. It's really bad. It's not just personal. We hurt each other with this one in an exceptional way. So another reason is network effect. And that means everybody already has like all their pictures and all their past and all their stuff on these properties that belong to companies like Facebook. And for everybody to get off it all at once so they can continue to have connections with each other is a coordination problem that's essentially impossible at scale. So that's a network effect problem. So why am I asking people to do something that can only happen a little? And the reason why is even if it only happens a little, it's incredibly important. So let me draw a metaphor to some things that have happened in the past. We have in the past had mass addictions that were tied to corrupt commercial motives at a large scale. One example is the cigarette industry. Another example is big alcoholic beverages. I could mention others. Lead paint is one I bring up in the book. Now, in these cases, well, actually, no, lead paint wasn't an addiction thing, so I'll leave out lead paint. So let's just talk about cigarettes. And in the case of cigarettes, when I was growing up, it was almost impossible to challenge cigarettes. Cigarettes were manly, they were cool. If you were on the red side of America, they were the cowboy thing. If you were on the blue side, they were the cool beatnik thing. Everybody had a cigarette. And you just couldn't be cool without your cigarette. But enough people finally realized that they could get out from under it, that at least it allowed a conversation. The addict will defend it. If you talk to somebody who's really addicted to cigarettes, it's very hard for them to really get a clear view of what the cigarette means to society, what it means to have cigarette in public spaces. There was a time when this room would have been filled with cigarette smoke, and we would have been gradually killing the students who were attending. pardon me, I think I'm coughing in sympathy with remembering what that was like, because it was really horrible. Alcohol. Mothers Against Drunk Driving or drunk drivers, I forget which it is, has been one of the most effective political organizations. They changed laws, they changed awareness, they changed outcomes and saved an enormous number of lives, despite the fact that, once again, alcohol's cool. It's supposed to be cool to drink at a frat party. It's supposed to be cool to drink at your fancy restaurant. Everybody loves drinking, and there's this whole world of advertising liquor. We found a reasonable compromise in both cases. We don't throw people who drink or smoke cigarettes in jail, like we've done for marijuana for years. Instead, we came up with a reasonable policy. Don't do it in public. Don't do it behind the wheel. It worked. That was only possible because we had enough people who were outside of the addiction system to have a conversation. In this case, we don't have that. In this case, all the journalists who should be helping us are addicted to Twitter and making fools of themselves. If you're a journalist in this room, you know I'm telling the truth. Same for politicians. Same for public figures, celebrities who might be helpful. We need to create just a space to have a conversation outside of the addiction system. Now, you might be thinking, oh my God, I'll destroy my life if I'm not on these things. I don't think it's true. I think if you actually drop these things, you suddenly discover you can have any life you want. I'm not claiming that I'm the most successful writer or public speaker, but I'm pretty successful. I have best-selling books. I get around. You hired me to come talk to you, and I've never had an account on any of these things. And you can say, oh, but you're an exception in this way, that way. I mean, how much of an exception can I be? I have plenty of points against me. I'm like this weirdo. And I still, no, seriously, I still can do it. If I can do it, probably other people can do it too. I think that there's this illusion that your whole life, you'll just be erased if you're not on these things. But that illusion is exactly part of the problem. That's exactly part of this weird existential, insecure need for attention at any cost, bizarre personality dysfunction that's destroying us. Just give it a rest. Now, here's what I would say. There was a time when, if you were young especially, one of the priorities that you felt in your life was to know yourself. And the only way to know yourself is to test yourself. And the way you test yourself is maybe you go trekking in the Himalayas or something. I used to hitchhike into central Mexico when I was really young, just a really young teenager. And that's how I tested myself. These days, I think the similar idea would be quitting your social media and really deleting it. Like you can't like quit Facebook and keep Instagram. That's bullshit. You have to actually delete the whole fucking thing. And then it doesn't mean you're doing it for your whole life. Delete everything and then stay off the stuff for 6 months. Okay? If you're young, you can afford it. It will not kill you. And then after 6 months, you will have learned, and then you make a decision. In my opinion, you should not harm your life for the sake of the ideas I've talked about today. If it's really true that your career will be better or whatever through using these things, then you need to follow your truth and do what makes you succeed. And if it's really true that being a serf to stupid Silicon Valley giant is the thing that helps your career, okay. But you have to be the one making that decision. And if you haven't tested yourself, you don't have standing to even know. So I'm not telling you what's right for you, but I demand that you discover what's right for you. That, I think, is a fair demand given the stakes. And with that, cheerful closing, I will call it a talk.
So we have, is the mic on? So do we have the questions? Have people, well, we were going to have cards. I don't know if any cards have made their way.
There's a card.
Cards, okay.
I'm actually unclear on how this whole thing works, so.
Okay, well, this was, all right, so. Normally I would get a bunch of cards, but I haven't. That hasn't happened yet. Okay, lately I've noticed that I was getting progressively more cranky. That's now a technical term. I think you've introduced that along with virtual reality. Cranky from a lack of sleep because of the excessive blue light given off by screens. Have you factored this effect into your theory?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a ton of stuff like that.
There's more. As soon as I put blue filters on my screens, I got a lot less cranky.
Okay. The problem of blue light keeping you up, and so those are all real problems. And in fact, you might want to just turn color off on your computer. Definitely turn color off on your phone. In all seriousness, you don't need it for most things. I have color. I use a phone, but I definitely have color off. And like, make those changes if you notice something like that. Yeah, you can.
You need a new blue filter. It's the blue light that's...
Right, you can turn off the blue light on your computer. You can go into a setting and you'll, the best way to do it, go to the visual accessibility settings because they have these high contrast settings for people who have trouble focusing and they get rid of color as it becomes stark contrast. As an example, oh, for God's sakes, I have to enter this. I was going to show you what it looks like, but I'm not going to bother with the code. Anyway, you can do it. Every major platform has this ability. It's really that, and you should do it. Go to commonsensemedia.org or to Center for Humane Technology's website, and both of them have advice on how to do things like this. And another thing is I'm pretty sure both Windows and Mac, if it's a computer, have ways to make the blue light go away as the evening approaches. There's like this kind of stuff. This is real stuff, and you should pay attention to it, and the technology should serve you and not drive you crazy. But I do have to say, this is not an existential threat. This is at the level of too much sugar in breakfast cereals or something like that. It is actually a real issue. It does have an effect on the health of the population, but it's not going to destroy us. This other stuff I'm talking about is at another level.
Okay. So rather than the cards, do we have cards? We do. Okay, great. Let's get some cards. Is that your card? Yes. Oh, okay, great. Okay, here's my card. Isn't there a design problem for publishing online if you know who's pointing at you? How is that related to the problem Alan Turing faced? Turing. It says Turing. He hatched the concept of a machine-like personality. Isn't that to software what listening and compassion is to human communication?
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting question. To me, when I read Turing's final notes, the Turing test comes up twice. It comes up in a little monograph he wrote, and it comes up in a sort of a little note. There's two statements of it. And in both of them, to me, reading them, there's just this profound sadness. I feel like this is this person who's just screaming out. So some of you might, I don't know, there's a whole history to this thing. That what Turing did is he created a metaphor. Oh boy. Let me try to do this as fast as I can. Turing did as much as anybody to defeat the Nazis in World War II by using one of the first computers that ever existed to break a Nazi secret code called Enigma. He was considered a great war hero. However, he lived an identity that was illegal at that time, which is that he was gay. And he was forced by the British government after the war to accept a bizarre quack treatment for being gay, which was to overdose on female sexual hormones with this bizarre idea that female hormones would balance his oversexiness, which was supposed to be the gay. It's like so stupid, it's hard to even repeat it. And he started developing female physiological characteristics as a result of that treatment. And he committed suicide by a sort of a weird poetic thing where he laced an apple with cyanide and ate it next to the first computer. Sort of anti-Eve or something. And he was a very brilliant and poetic man. And in the final couple of weeks of his life, he came up with this idea of repurposing an old Victorian parlor game that used to be this thing where you'd have a man and a woman behind a curtain or a screen of some kind, and all they could do is pass little messages to a judge, and the judge would have to tell who's the man and who's the woman, and each of them might be trying to fool the judge, which is kind of a weird, if you think about it. The Victorians were pretty kinky and bizarre. And so what you're doing is, as with behaviorism and as with the internet, you're slicing away all of these factors and just turning it into like this limited stream of information. So it's kind of like tweeting or something. And so what Turing said is, what if you got rid of the woman and you had a man and a computer, and the judge couldn't tell them apart? Wouldn't then finally you have to admit that the computer should be given rights and be given stature and be treated? And when you read it, the way I read it is it's this person saying, oh my God, I figured out how to save the world from these people who wanted to destroy everybody based on being of the wrong identity. These people who wanted to kill not only gays, but of course Jews and gypsies and black people and these horrible people. And I came up with this way of defeating them, and now you're destroying me for who I am. And I feel like there's this kind of astonishing sadness in it, and the way Turing's, and so that was the birth of the idea of artificial intelligence. And I feel like the way it's remembered is completely unlike what it's like to read the original. You know, I feel like if you look at have you ever read the original Turing? Because if you read the original Turing, I mean, it's like, it's intense. You know, here's this person who's being tortured to death. It's like, it's not some kind of nerdy thing at all. It's difficult to read the documents, and I think it was like this crazy. I think he knew he was about to die, and I think he was reaching out for some sort of a fantasy of what kind of a thing. What would it take for people to not be cruel? What would it take? And I think in this very dark moment, he thought maybe giving up humanity entirely, and maybe if we're just machines, maybe we won't do this to ourselves. And the thing about that, of course, is we've turned ourselves sort of into machines, because we're kind of acting like machines to be able to use the stuff. You're all sitting there all day entering your like little codes to get online. You're sort of turning into machines in practice, and yet we've just become more and more cruel. Like that's the ultimate irony, is that it didn't help. So that's my take on it. And this idea that AI could be some form of compassion, I think is kind of bullshit. I think it's really just a way of stealing data from people who should be paid to translate. AI is theft, to paraphrase. Anyway.
Okay, we
looking to AI to replace compassion and listening.
AI is just a way. Look, all we can do with computers to be a good technologist, you have to believe that people are sort of mystically better than machines. Otherwise, you end up with gobbledygook and nonsense. You can't design for machines. So AI has to be understood as a channel for taking data from one person to help another person. I take the data from the translators and I apply it through a machine learning scheme or some kind of scheme, and I can get translations that help people in a better way than I could without that scheme in between, which is wonderful. So it's technology to help people connect in a way that's more helpful. If you understand AI that way, you elevate people and you don't confuse yourself. Anyway, let's move to...
Okay, yeah, we don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot of great questions, so some questions are not going to be able to be answered now, although I want to mention that there will be a book signing and book purchasing outside after the event is over. There'll be 2 tables. Please,
but you can't ask me long questions. You can't go up to me, come up to me and ask like some open-ended giant question. And I'm signing your book that would take an hour. Like you really can't do that.
Buy a book. The people who are selling the books have asked that you buy a book first before you have it signed. And on that note, I'll segue into there's a couple questions that are connected to this about your market solution. Arguably, the mess we're in now comes from the monopolistic and manipulative tendencies inherent in markets. Given that the world has never known pure markets, what would keep this one pure?
Oh, it's not going to be pure. It's going to be annoying and unfair and horrible. But the thing about it is it won't be existentially horrible. The thing about market, so what I believe about economic philosophies is there's never been one that's worked out in practice. And instead, just as with moral philosophies and theories of how we learn and many, many other areas where we're trying to deal with very complex systems, it's not so much that we can seek the perfect answer, but we have to trade off between partial answers. So to me, there's never been a pure market. There's never been, and I don't think there ever could be. But I think what you can do is you can get a balance. This was the Keynesian approach to economics. I think is very wise. You get a balance between reasonable oversight and a reasonably unfettered market, and they'll go through cycles where the market will need help, and you trade off. And I think that's the only path we have. I think being an ideologue for any solution to a highly complicated problem is always wrong.
Okay, just two more then, and there's a couple like this as well. What about the connecting force of social media, e.g. for the feminist movement like Me Too? These online communities raise awareness and create supportive communities, and then many people rely on social media for community because of the demands of capitalist jobs. Yeah,
it's just, that's all true, except it backfires, and the backfire is worse than the original. So, like, what happened, it just keeps on happening. I mean, like, before Me Too, there was a problem of diversity in the gaming world, and a few women in gaming just wanted to be able to say one or two things and not be totally invisible. And then the result of that was this voracious thing called Gamergate that was just this total never shut up, totally wipe everybody else out, totally make it everything horrible movement. And then Me Too has spawned this other thing that's still rising, which is the incels and the Proud Boys and all this stuff. And the problem is that in these open systems, at first, your experience of finding mutual support and creating social change is authentic, it's real. It's just that there's this machine you're not thinking about behind the scenes that's using the fuel you're providing in the form of the data to irritate these other people because it gets even more of a rise from them, and you're creating this other thing that's even more powerful, that's horrible, even though it wasn't your intent. And that's the thing that keeps on happening over and over again. It doesn't invalidate the validity of the good stuff that happens first, it's just that it always backfires. Well, not always, but typically, and you end up being slammed, and you don't even, like, one of the things that's really bad about it is that it seems like it's just the fault of the creeps who come up, where it's actually kind of more the fault of the algorithms that introduced the creeps to each other and then got them excited in this endless cycle of using your good intentions to irritate the worst people. So, I mean, I know, the thing is, it's true, Black Lives Matter was great, I think. I mean, I think it's wonderful, and yet the reaction to it was horrible and of a higher magnitude. And I just think we have to find, unfortunately, until we can get rid of the advertising model and the giant manipulation machine, every time you use the big platforms for any kind of positive social effect, it'll backfire and destroy you, and it's a fool's game, even though it's valid at first. In the long term, it's a fool's game. Okay, I don't like saying that. I hate saying that. It breaks my heart.
This is the last question, and it's existential one. I'll combine the two questions here. Seeing how pernicious social media has become by being hijacked toward bummer end. I know bummer is another technical term you use in your last book. Yeah.
There's a wonderful writer on cyber things named Sherry Turkle, and she read my book and she said, "Oh, I love this book, but there's just too much tush in it." And the thing, because there's like bummer and there's a cat's behind on the cover and all this stuff. The problem is I married a woman who likes butt jokes, and I just can't, I don't know, somehow they just come, I don't know, anyway.
Okay,
just
so it's not over yet.
Okay, go ahead.
How to guard against an immersive technology like virtual reality becoming even more insidiously bummer? And then, how do you know what is real?
Okay. Well, all right, those are small questions. So The first one, I mean, I think the way to keep virtuality could be super hyper creepy. I wrote a book about virtuality that we have mentioned. It's called Dawn of the New Everything. I don't know if they'll have it up front or not, but I talk a lot about that issue. So virtuality could potentially be creepy. I think the way to tell whether something's getting creepy is whether there's a business model for creepiness. So if the way it's making money is that there's somebody to the side who thinks they can sneakily alter you or manipulate you, that's the creepy engine. If there isn't that person and if there isn't that business going on, it's less likely to be creepy. I think that's actually a pretty simple question to answer. I think it boils down to incentives. I think incentives run the world as much or more than anything else. As far as this question of how do you know what's real, the answer is imperfect. What you do is you struggle for it. You struggle to do scientific experiments, to publish. You have to always recognize you can fool yourself. You have to recognize that whole communities of people can fool themselves, and you just struggle and struggle and struggle, and you gradually start to form a little island in a sea of mystery in which you never have total confidence, but you start to have a little confidence. So there's some things that we can be confident of now. The Earth is round. Not online, but do we know it in an absolute sense? No. You can never know reality absolutely, but you can know it pretty well. And so in order to talk about reality, you have to get used to near perfection that is never actual perfection. And if you're not comfortable with that concept, you have no hope of getting to reality. Because that's the nature of reality. Reality is not something you ever know absolutely. And in fact, just to be clear, in one of my books I defined reality as the thing that can never be measured exactly. It's the thing that can never be simulated accurately. It's the thing that can never be described to perfection. That is reality. But because the simulation can be described to perfection. I can describe to you a video game world or a virtual world to perfection. I can't do that with reality. The thing is, though, that we can't demand absolute knowledge in order to have any knowledge at all, or else we make ourselves into genuine fools. We have to be able to accept that we can have better knowledge than other knowledge. It's all an incremental sort of eternal improvement project. So the people who demand absolute proof of climate change are fools. But they're interesting. Some of you might have read, there was a good history published this week about the history of the reading wars, about how we learn reading. And there's this community of people who've just been absolutely unable to accept a load of scientific evidence about how to teach kids to read effectively because of an ideology. And they're sincere. And it's like it's really, really hard. Accepting reality is your life's work. It's really, really, really hard. It doesn't come naturally necessarily. It's a discipline.
Thank you.
All right.